John Morrison was and will always be my North Star. Naturally, the pain wrought by his ceaseless and incremental deterioration over the last 5 years at the hands of his Alzheimer's dementia has been invariably devastating for my family. In addition to the raw agony of it all, and in keeping with the metaphor, the dimming of his light has often left me desperately lost and maddeningly aimless. With time, however, I found meaning through trying to live up to him and who he was. Chasing his memory has allowed me to harness that crushing pain for what it was and continues to be, a representation of what a monument of a man John Morrison truly was. If he wasn't worth remembering, his erasure wouldn't hurt nearly as much. A few weeks ago, John Morrison died. His death was the first and last mercy of his disease process. And while I feel some bittersweet relief that his fragmented consciousness can finally rest, I also find myself unnerved in equal measure. After his passing, I discovered a set of documents under the mattress of his hospice bed. Some sort of journal, or maybe logbook, is a better way to describe it. Even if you were to disclude the actual content of these documents, their very existence is a bit mystifying. First and foremost, my father has not been able to speak a meaningful sentence for at least 6 months, let alone write one. And yet, I find myself holding a series of articulately worded and precisely written journal entries in his handwriting with his very distinctive narrative voice intact no less. Upon first inspection, my explanation for these documents was that they were old and that one of my other family members must have left it behind when they were visiting him one day. Why they would have effectively hidden said documents under his mattress, I have no idea. But upon further evaluation, and to my absolute bewilderment, I found evidence that these documents had absolutely been written recently. We moved John into this particular hospice facility half a year ago, and one peculiar quirk of this institution is the way they approach providing meals for their dying patients. Every morning, without fail at sunrise, the aides distribute menus detailing what is going to be available to eat throughout the day. I always found this a bit odd. People on death's door aren't known for their voracious appetite or distinct interest in a rotating set of meals prepared with the assistance of a few local grocery chains, but ultimately wholesome and humanizing. John Morrison had created this logbook in delicate blue ink on the back of these menus. However strange, I think I could reconcile and attribute finding incoherent scribbles on the back of loose-leaf paper menus, mysteriously sequestered under a mattress, to the inane wonders of a rapidly crystallizing brain. Incoherent scribbles are not what I have sitting in a disorderly stack to the left of my laptop as I type this. I am making this post to immortalize the transcripts of John Morrison's deathbed logbook. In doing so, I find myself ruminating on the point and potential dangers of doing so. I might be searching for some understanding, and then maybe the meaning of it all. Morally, I think sharing what he recorded in the brief, lucid moments before his inevitable curtain call may be exceptionally self-centered. But I am finding my morals to be suspended by the continuing, desperate search for guidance, a surrogate North Star to fill the vacuum created by the untoward loss of a great man. Although I recognize my actions here may only serve to accelerate some looming cataclysm. For these logs to make sense, I will need to provide a brief description of who John Morrison was. Socially, he was gentle and a bit soft-spoken, despite his innate understanding of humor, which usually goes hand in hand with extroversion. Throughout my childhood, however, that introversion did evolve into overwhelming reclusiveness. I try not to hold it against him, as his monasticism was a byproduct of devotion to his work and his singular hobby. Broadly, he paid the bills with a science background and found meaning through art. More specifically, he was a cellular biologist and an amateur oil painter. I think he found his fullness through the juxtaposition of biology and art. He once told me that he felt that pursuing both disciplines with equal vigor would allow him to find their common endpoint, the elusive location where intellectualism and faith eventually merged and became indistinguishable from one another. I think he felt like that was enlightenment, even if he never explicitly said so. In his 9-to-5, he was a researcher at the cutting edge of what he described as cellular topography. Essentially, He was looking at characterizing the architecture of human cells at an extremely microscopic level. He would say, "Looking at a cell under a normal microscope is like looking at a map of America, a top-down, big-picture view. I'm looking at the cell like I'm one person walking through a small town in Kansas. I'm recording and documenting the peaks, the valleys, the ponds. I'm mapping the minute landmarks that characterize the boundless infinity of life." I will not pretend to even remotely grasp the implications of that statement, and this in spite of the fact that I too pursued a biologic career, so I do have some background knowledge. I just don't often observe cells at a small town in Kansas level as a hospital pediatrician. As his life progressed, it was burgeoning dementia that sidelined him from his career. He retired at the very beginning of both the pandemic and my physician training. I missed the early stages of it all, but I heard from my sister that he cared about his retirement until he didn't remember what his career was to begin with. She likened it to sitting outside in the waning heat of the summer sun as the day transitions from late afternoon to nightfall. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he was losing the warmth of his ambitions until he couldn't remember the feeling of warmth at all in the depth of this new night. His fascination and subsequent pathologic disinterest with painting mirrored the same trajectory. Normally, if he was home and awake, he would be in his studio, developing a new piece. He had a variety of influences, but he always desired to unify the objective beauty of Claude Monet and the immaterial abstraction of Picasso. He was always one for marrying opposites, until his disease absconded with that as well. Because of his merging of styles, his works were not necessarily beloved by the masses. They were a little too chaotic and unintelligible, I think. Not that he went out of his way to sell them or even show them off. The only one I can visualize off the top of my head is a depiction of the oak tree in our backyard that he drew with realistic human vasculature, visible and pulsing underneath the bark. At 8, this scared the shit out of me, and I could not tell you what point he was trying to make. Nor did he go out of his way to explain his point, not even as reparations for my slight arboreal traumatization. But enough preamble. Below I will detail his first entry, or what I think is his first entry. I say this because, although the entries are dated, none of the dates fall within the last 6 months. In fact, they span over 2 decades in total. I was hoping the back-facing menus would be date-stamped, as this would be an easy way to determine their narrative sequence. But unfortunately, this was not the case. One evening, about a week after he died, I called and asked his case manager at the hospice if she could help determine which menu came out when, much to her immediate and obvious confusion. Retrospectively, I can understand how this would be an odd question to pose after John died. I reluctantly shared my discovery of the logbook, for which she also had no explanation. What she could tell me is that none of his care team ever observed him writing anything down, nor do they like to have loose pens floating around their memory unit because they could pose a danger to their patients. John Morrison was known to journal throughout his life, though he was intensely private about his writing and seemingly would dispose of his journals upon completion. I don't recall exactly when he began journaling, but I have vivid memories of being shooed away when I did find him writing in his notebooks. In my adolescence, I resented him for this. But in the end, I've tried to let bygones be bygones. As a small aside, he went out of his way to meticulously draw some tables figures, as evidently some vestigial scientific methodology hid away from the wildfire that was his dementia, only to re-emerge in the lead-up to his death. I will scan and upload those pictures with the entries. I will have pored over all of the entries by the time I post this. A lot has happened in the weeks since he's passed, and I plan on including commentary to help contextualize the entries. It may take me some time. As a final note, he included an image which can be found at this link. This arcane letterhead is copied perfectly between entries. And I mean perfect. They are all literally identical. Just like the unforeseen resurgence of John's analytical mind, his dexterous hand also apparently intermittently reawakened during his time in hospice, despite the fact that when I visited him, I would be helping him dress, brush his teeth, etc. I will let you all know ahead of time that this tableau is the divine and horrible cornerstone, the transcendent and anathematized bedrock, the cursed fucking linchpin. As much as I want to emphasize its importance, I can't effectively explain why it is so important at the moment. All I can say now is that I believe that John Morrison did find his common endpoint, and it may cost us everything. Entry 1, dated as April 2004. First translocation. The morning of the first translocation was like any other. I awoke around 9 a.m. Lucy was already out of bed and probably had been for some time. Peter and Lily had really become a handful over the last few years, and Lucy would need help giving Lily her medications. Wearily, I stood at the top of our banister, surveying the beautiful disaster that was raising young children. Legos strewn across every surface with reckless abandon. Stains of unknown origin. I am grateful, of course, but good Lord, the absolute devastation. I walked clandestinely down the stairs, avoiding perceived creaking floorboards as if they were landmines, hoping to sneak out the front door and get a deep breath of fresh air prior to joining my wife in the kitchen. Unfortunately, Lucy had been gifted with incredible spatial awareness. With a single aberrant footstep, a whisper of a creaking floorboard betrayed me, and I felt Lucy peer sharp daggers into me. Her echolocation, as always, was unparalleled. "Oh, look, Dad's awake," Lucy proclaimed with a smirk. She had doomed me with less than 5 words. I heard Lily and Peter dropping silverware in an excited frenzy. "Touch, love," I replied with resignation. I hugged each of them good morning as they came barreling towards me and returned them to the syrup-ridden battlefield that was our kitchen table. Peter was 6. Bleach blonde hair, a swath of freckles covering the bridge of his nose. He's a kind, introspective soul, I think. A revolving door of a typical childhood interests, though. Ghosts and mini-golf as of late. Lily, on the other hand, was 3. A complete and utter contrast to Peter, which we initially welcomed with open arms. Gregarious and frenetic, already showing interest in sports, not things my son found value in. The only difference we did not treasure was her health. Peter was perfectly healthy, but Lily was found to have a kidney tumor that needed to be surgically excised a year ago, along with her kidney. Lucy, as always, stood slender and radiant in the morning light, attending to some dishes over the sink. We met when we were both 18 and had grown up together. When I remembered to, I let her know that she was my kaleidoscope. Looking through her, the bleak world had beauty, and maybe even meaning if I looked long enough. After setting the kids at the table, I helped her with the dishes, and we talked a bit about work. I had taken the position at CellSep 2 weeks ago. The hours were grueling, but the pay was triple what I was earning at my previous job. Lily's chemotherapy was more important than my sanity. Lucy and I had both agreed on this fact with a half shit-eating, half earnest grin on the day I signed my contract. Thankfully, I had been scouted alongside a colleague, Majorie. Majorie was 15 years my junior, a true savant when it came to cellular biology. It was an honor to work alongside her, even on the days it made me question my own validity as a scientist. Perhaps more importantly, though, Lucy and her were close friends. Lucy and I discussed the transition, finances, and other topics quietly for a few minutes, until she said something that gave me pause. "How are you feeling?" Beyond the exhaustion, I mean. I set the plate I was scrubbing down, trying to determine exactly what she was getting at. "I'm okay, hanging in best I can." She scrunched her nose to that response, an immediate and damning physiologic indicator that I had not given her an answer that was close enough to what she was fishing for. "You sure you're doing okay?" "Yeah, I am," I replied. She put her head down. In conjunction with the scrunched nose, I could tell her frustration was rising. "John, you just started a new medication, and the seizure wasn't that long ago. I know you want to be stoic and all that, but..." I turned to her, incredulous. I had never had a seizure before in my life. I take a few Tylenol here and there, but otherwise I wasn't on any medication. "Lucy, what are you talking about?" I said. She kept her head down. No response. "Lucy?" I put a hand on her shoulder. This is where I think the translocation starts, or maybe a few seconds ago when she asked about the seizure. In a fleeting moment, all the ambient noise evaporated from our kitchen. I could no longer hear the kids babbling, the water splashing off dishes, the birds singing distantly outside the kitchen window. As the word Lucy fell out of my mouth, it unnaturally filled all of that empty space. I practically startled myself. It felt like I had essentially shouted in my own ear. Lucy and the kids were caught and fixed in a single motion, statuesque and uncanny. Lucy with her head down at the sink, Lily sitting up straight and gazing outside the window with curiosity. Peter was the only one turned towards me, both hands on the edge of his chair with his torso tilted forward, suspended in the animation of getting up from the kitchen table. As I stepped towards Lucy, I noticed that Peter's eyes would follow my position in the room, unblinking. No movement from any other part of his body to accompany his eyes tracking me. Then at some point, I noticed a change in my peripheral vision to the right of where I was standing. The blackness may have just blinked into existence, or it may have crept in slowly as I was preoccupied with the silence and my newly catatonic family. I turned cautiously, something primal in me trying to avoid greeting the waiting abyss. Where my living room used to stand, there now stood an empty room bathed in fluorescent light from an unclear source, sickly yellow rays reflecting off of an alien tile floor. There were no walls to this room. At a certain point, the tile flooring transitioned into inky darkness in every direction. In the middle of the room, there was a man on a bench, watching me turn towards him. With my vision enveloped by these new Stygian surroundings, a cacophonous deluge of sound returned to me. Every plausible sound ever experienced by humanity, present and accounted for. Laughing, crying, screaming, shouting, machines and music and nature, an insurmountable and uninterruptible wave of force. At the threshold of my insanity, the man in the center stepped up from the bench. He was holding both arms out, palms faced upwards. His skin was taut and tented on both of his wrists, tired flesh rising about a foot symmetrically above each hand. Dried blood streaks led up to a center point of the stretched skin, where a fountain of mercurial silver erupted upwards. Following the silver with my eyes, I could see it divided into thousands of threads, each with slightly different angular trajectories, all moving heaven-bound into the void that replaced my living room ceiling. With the small motion of bringing both of his hands slightly forward and towards me, the cacophony ceased in an instant. I then began to appreciate the figure before me. He stood at least 10 feet tall. His arms and legs were the same proportions, which gave his upper extremities an unnatural length. His face, however, devoured my attention. The skin of his face was a deep red consistent with physical strain, glistening with sweat. He wore a tiny smile, the sides of his lips barely rising up to make a smile recognizable. His unblinking eyes, however, were unbearably discordant with that smile. In my life, I have seen extremes of both physical and mental pain. I have seen the eyes of someone who splintered their femur in a hiking accident, bulging with agony. I have seen the eyes of a mother whose child was stillborn, wild with melancholy. The pain, the absolute oblivion, in this figure's eyes easily surpassed the existential discomfort of both of those memories. And with those eyes squarely fixated on my own, I found myself somewhere else. My consciousness returned to its set point in a hospital bed. There was a young man beside me, holding my hand. Couldn't have been more than 14. I retracted my hand out of his grip with significant force. The boy slid back in his chair, clearly startled by my sudden movement. Before I could ask him what was going on, Lucy jogged into the room, her work stilettos clacking on the wooden floor. I pleaded with her to get this stranger out of here, to explain what was happening, to give me something concrete to anchor myself to. With a sense of urgency, Lucy said, "Peter, honey, could you go get your uncle from the waiting room and give your father and I a moment?" The hospital's neurologist explained that I suffered a grand mal seizure while at home. She also explained that all of the testing so far did not show an obvious reason for the seizure, like a tumor or stroke. More testing to come, but she was hopeful nothing serious was going on. We talked about the visions I had experienced, which she chalked up to an atypical aura, or a sudden and unusual sensation that can sometimes precede a seizure. Lucy and I spoke for a few minutes while Peter retrieved his uncle. As she recounted our lives, home address, current work struggles, etc., I slowly found memories of Lily's 8th birthday party, Peter's first day of middle school, Lucy and I taking a trip to Bermuda to celebrate my promotion at CellCept. When Peter returned with his uncle, I thankfully did recognize him as my son. Initially, I was satisfied with the explanation given to me for my visions. Additionally, confusion and disorientation after seizures is a common phenomenon known as a post-ictal state. It all gave me hope. That false hope endured only until my next translocation, prompting me to document my experiences. End of entry 1. John was actually a year off. I was 15 when he had his first seizure. Date-wise, he is correct, though. He first received his late-onset epilepsy diagnosis in April of 2004, right after my mother's birthday that year. The memory he has initially recalled, if it is real, would have happened in 1995. I apologize, but I am exhausted and will need to stop transcription here for now. I will upload again when I am able.